glad you are here and joining us for this new Bible Studies for Life series. As we jump into this, I hope that you'll take the time to grab a book if you're in Waycross and you can get by the church. If you'll come by and pick up one of these books that I just dropped, that'd be awesome. And this is what one of the front covers looks like. They have some various different covers based on the age group that it's geared towards, but you can follow along in most all of them. And our first study is called After God's Own Heart and a Fresh Look at the Ten Commandments. Let me grab this book I dropped. See, the idea is a lot of times, and even today, when we teach on the Ten Commandments, we teach with a negative input. We teach from a thou shalt not, which is specifically how God gave the commandments. However, there is much in Scripture that would lead us to look towards them in a thou shalt. And these are things that you should do. And these are ways and behaviors that you should take on. And this is how you can take them on. And so what the authors of this study have attempted to do, and it's going to be fascinating as we go through it, is they have attempted to take the life of David, a man who in Scripture is called a man after God's own heart, and they have attempted to take David's life and lay that alongside the commandments and see how David followed these commandments in his life, thus giving us a picture of how we can follow God's commandments in our own life. And this is a reminder too. A lot of times there's a lot of emphasis put on the Ten Commandments. We've made a huge emphasis in the last decade, a couple decades in our country about the ability to display them publicly in public venues, things like courthouses and places like that. And it's always been fascinating to me as I've heard those arguments. And by the way, I'm not opposed to placing them in any public venue or place, but it's always been fascinating to me that in the same communities where people say that placing the Ten Commandments on the courthouse steps or in the courthouse yard or in the hallway of the courthouse is the most important thing that we can do, in those same communities there are churches that line the corners of every street. And Jesus tells us, Jesus' command to us is to love our neighbor, love God, and in so doing we're going to show His love, as John reassures us later in one of his writings. And so it's always fascinated me that we think there's a bigger importance on hanging a sign than it is the way we live our lives. And so I am excited about how this study is going to take David's life and lay it alongside the commandments and give us an opportunity to see how we can live our lives. And I have to tell you before we even get started, yes, Scripture says that David is a man after God's own heart. But it says that because of behaviors that David exhibited and that he utilized. It doesn't say that because he was perfect. It doesn't say that because he always chose well. In fact, at times David chose absolutely foolishly, and at times he chose absolutely out of evil, out of selfish intent. And so don't get hung up on that and say, well, David's perfect, I can't be perfect. In other words, let's look at this. And so as we do so, it asks the question to begin with, when is a time in your life that you were looking for a difficult solution only to find out that there was a simple problem? And the author of our story tells about a man who goes to a doctor and proclaims that he's in pain all over. And it's a little bit of a humorous story. And so the doctor says, well, show me where. And so the man touches his shoulder and he says, oh, see, doctor, it hurts right here. And he says, well, touch your side. And so the man touches his side and he says, oh, doctor, see, it hurts right here. And the doctor reaches out himself and he touches the man's shoulder and he said, does that hurt? And the man says, no, that doesn't hurt. And so the doctor touches the man's side and he says, no, that doesn't hurt either. And ultimately the doctor says, well, your finger's out of joint. The problem is your finger. And it's a humorous way of trying to say that a lot of times in our life we have these complex ideas of what it is and how we should live our lives when they really have some very simplistic solutions. Jesus told us that the Ten Commandments really boil down to two things: love of God and love of our neighbor. And we cannot do this study without being reminded that Jesus' idea and teaching about love of our neighbor meant all the way through to the person who would do us evil if it was within their power. You can't read this and you can't study this lesson with any bit of honesty at all if you're not willing to take Jesus' interpretation of what it means to love our neighbor and who our neighbor is. And so we're going to look at this truth and this reality. So jump in with me. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 21 through 6. So if you don't have a book, then maybe you have a Bible and you have some of these things. And the opportunity as we look at how the Israelites were commanded by God and how they should live, and then how you and I can reflect that today, because we can look at what David had to say and the example that he gives us. So Exodus chapter 20 verse 1 through 6 says this: "And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. Do not have other gods besides me. Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them, and do not serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the father's iniquity, to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing faithful love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands." We're going to make a couple of deviations here, or a couple of detours, if you will. Not deviations, but detours, if you will, as we look at this passage of Scripture. And I want to challenge you about why the Israelites had a tendency to worship these gods, because we need to bring this down to our level, and we need to see it from our point of view. See, the Israelites worshiped various gods that they fashioned out of gold, that they fashioned out of silver, that they fashioned out of wood. And these were the gods that they worshiped in an attempt to be successful. Now let me say that again as I reach down once again to grab my book. The Israelites worshiped these gods in an attempt to be successful. You say, well, what do you mean by that? Well, let me help you understand. They were an agrarian society. They were a society of farmers. What were farmers dependent upon? Rain. Rain at the right time. Sunshine. Sunshine at the right time. Harvest coming right. The coolness of the air being at the right time. The warmth of the air being at the right time. And so they had a lot of things that they were dependent upon. You and I have a lot of things that we're dependent upon. In fact, right now I'm engaged in a conversation with someone who's talking about the stock market as we are going into the 1st of September. And, you know, everybody's excited. I say everybody, but a lot of people are excited about what the stock market looks like right now. And but that has implications. And so as we begin to look at these things and we begin to challenge ourselves on what this means in our lives, we have to ask ourselves, what are some of the gods that we create? You see, if the Israelites fashioned a god out of wood to pray for it for rain, because they had to have rain, guys and girls, then what are some of the things that we fashion it out of? Like, for example, maybe you're athletic and maybe you have some athletic ability. You're one of my students and you have some athletic ability. We might fashion our god after some other athlete. In other words, we might completely pursue after the standards and the ideas that that person sets forth. In other words, instead of quoting Jesus on things, and instead of quoting Old Testament prophets on things, we're quoting athletic gurus or things like that. In other words, our whole, and that's the fourth time I've said in other words in the last 35 seconds, but our whole emphasis in life revolves through getting this thing that we want. And we think it's absolutely necessary to us. We think it's necessary to our life. It's necessary to our economic success. In other words, having money in our pockets. It's necessary to our physical ability. This is exactly what the Israelites were doing. You have to understand that when they created these gods and they fashioned them out of stone, they didn't go just dig up a rock and say, come on guys, let's see what we can make up today. They dug up a rock because their pagan neighbors right next door had rocks set up on their windowsills, and they're out dancing around and cutting themselves and putting things down so that they can get rain. And so the Israelites look over at their pagan neighbors and they're like, well, it's not raining here, but it's raining over there, and over there they're cutting out these rocks and building these things, so I don't know, let's build something like they do. And then they go after it. And it, so often it's just an alluring thing to understand how this works. So what are our needs today? Some of you students, you hear me on this for just a minute, and I know that I have to be very careful with how I say this, because I'm not trying to antagonize a family member who means well. I am also a parent of children who are growing into adulthood, and I have a concern for them to be established in their life, to be able to support themselves, to be able to live well, or have those things that you and I think are important. But here's the thing. We make gods in the United States of America in the church house out of having good credit. We make gods in the United States of America in our church houses out of having a good retirement. We make gods in the United States of America and in our church houses about having good health insurance. Nothing wrong with any of those three things. And there's nothing wrong with an Israelite man wanting rain at the right time. But oftentimes, we put those things as priority over serving God. And you say, no, wait a minute. I don't get it. I don't get it. I mean, I get how people could build a God and go worship it and dance around it on Friday nights, and how that's a distraction from serving God. And because of that, that's what God meant. Don't serve other gods. Well, let me ask you, what are you doing with your time? It's been literally 6 months. And the next week, it'll be 6 months since our church met in what we would consider a normal format. March the 16th was the last time we met regularly, and we met without Sunday school on that day. So March the 9th was the last time that our church met with a regular format that we followed. What have you been doing with your time? What do you do with your time on Sunday mornings now that you don't come to Sunday school? What do you do with your time on Wednesday nights now that you don't have youth studies? What are you doing with your time when you don't have to come to choir and sing? What are you pursuing? Hey, forget you. What about me? What am I pursuing? What am I doing with my time? How am I investing my time? What am I learning? What am I doing? And so the Israelites were just like you and I. When they saw somebody getting results, they said, I'm going to adopt that behavior and go get those results. The Israelites are looking at them and they're saying they're getting something out of what they're doing. Why can't we get something out of what we're doing? And so they begin to shape their behavior to fit that. And if we cannot see, students, listen to me for just a minute. You see that. As a teenager, you see it, and you see it very clearly. The question is not whether or not you see it now, but two things. Number one, do you see how you do it in your own life? And number two, will you be able to see it in 10 years? So the Israelites look over there and they see what their neighbor is doing, and they think, I have to pursue that. And guys and girls, let me ask you something. You're 13, 14, 15, 16. What do you see in your neighbors do that you think you have to pursue? What do you think that you have to do to get true enjoyment out of life that you can't get unless you live up to some certain expectation? What do you think it is that is going to make your life enjoyable? Because if we're not careful, we fall into the same trap that the Israelites fell into. Because here's the reality. God reminds Moses of who he is, that he is the Lord, the God, the one God. And he is a jealous God. And the idea you think of a jealous God as somebody who's trying to take back. And no, it's not. It's a God who is supremely focused. You see, God created the earth, he created this universe, and he sustains this universe, and he is sustaining us. And so he is intensely concerned and intensely involved with the decisions that we are making. And I know that may seem a little bit crazy because you look around and you say, well, it doesn't appear that way. But that's just because you and I have this idea that we have to have things go our way in order to serve God. But yet God is working in so many ways that allow us to acknowledge him. And there's so many stories in Scripture that give us that opportunity to see how he works. And so when God tells them, he says that don't make an idol for yourself. Listen, you and I don't have a problem with physical idols, more than likely. We do have a problem with idols that take up our time, idols that take up our energy, idols that take up our money. And more than likely, you're dealing with one of those right now, or two of those, or three of those. And I say more than likely because I am dealing with those. And everyone in their life is constantly having to evaluate those sorts of things. Do not think, just because we don't bow down to wooden idols, that we're not worshiping something. The where we're spending our time, where we're spending our energy, and where we are spending our money shows what we are worshiping. And that doesn't necessarily just mean church attendance. It doesn't necessarily mean doing good things for the church or in the church. Because there's a lot of ways that you and I can serve God that won't necessarily impact what happens at a physical address, like our church address, 301 Tomberlin Road, but will impact the way that we treat others and the way we identify. So what would it look like for you and I to place God first in our life in today's culture? What would your time structure look like? What would your energy structure look like? Would you spend more time trying to get to know people who are different from you? People who maybe share different viewpoints? Or instead are you going to try and hammer people down and shape them into your image? See, there's idolatry in that as well. Because God has called us to love others as He loves them. And in order to do that, we have to begin by starting where they are. You don't love someone by forcing them to become something and then starting to love someone. You love someone by identifying who they are and where they are and then moving forward from that point. So let's look at David's life that he tells us in Psalm 16. David kind of lays out some of his behavior. We're going to look at verses 1 through 4 and then look at verses 9 through 11 as we try to examine what does it mean to have a life and where we love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind, as God points out or gives to Moses originally. So here's what he says, Psalm 16 verses 1 through 4. Protect me, God, for I take refuge in you. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord, I have nothing good besides you. As for the holy people who are in the land, they are the noble ones. All my delight is in them. The sorrow of those who take another God for themselves will multiply. Here's the question that we have to ask ourselves as we go into this is God's goodness driving our commitment to Him or something else? In other words, if you're doing a daily devotion or you're trying to pray regularly or you're trying to show kindness to others or you're trying to love others, where does that stem from? Why is that originating, and where does that originate from? Does it originate from an idea that God Himself is good to you? Or does it originate from a view that you have to do certain things in order to be a good person? You see, David is making an observation here of himself, and he is saying that I have to have you, and you are my Lord. I have nothing good besides you. So let me ask you something. What would it take, what could I take away from you where you could look at me and say, I have nothing good besides God? Could I take your video games away, and would you say that? Could I take your entertainment away? Could I take your music away? Could I take your culture away? Your athletic ability? Your friendships? You say, well, why would you take stuff away? I don't want to take stuff away. What I want us to do is to truly evaluate where we're at in our life, because more than likely, if you are anything like I have been in my life, you find yourself pursuing a bunch of small idols that you didn't realize were idols. You made a lot of small good things the major good things in your life. And instead of honoring God in your life, and instead of seeking Him first in all you do, instead of recognizing His goodness, we're trying to live up to some moral code. And that's failure. Straight up from the bottom, that's failure. And so as we look at this passage, David says about God, you are my Lord, I have nothing good besides you. And here's the thing, the truth and the reality is we're going to be tempted to look at a lot of things. We're going to be tempted to look at our pain instead of God's purpose. We're going to begin to develop this idea that everyone is against us, or maybe everyone is for someone else, instead of trusting in God's reality. And so David is acknowledging he has nothing good besides God, and the only way you can say that is out of trust and dependence. And so there's our charge. Are we going to trust God? Or are we going to depend upon Him? So verses 9 through 11 help us sum this up. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My body also rests securely. For you will not abandon me to Sheol, the place of death. You will not allow your faithful one to see decay. You reveal the path of life to me. In your presence is abundant joy. At your right hand are eternal pleasures. David kind of wraps this thing up, and he says, you know what? The reality of it is my joy comes from you. And so you say, well, how can somebody's joy come from God? Well, I think it starts a little bit like this. In your circumstances, all the way to the point of the people who would destroy you? Are you willing to set that aside? You see, when the scripture says that David was a man after God's own heart, it speaks to this part of his life right here where David is saying, I am pursuing you with all that I am, and I trust in you. So you guys and girls, let me ask you something in your life. A lot of times we're pursuing acceptance, we're pursuing recognition, we're pursuing pleasure, a lot of other things before we start pursuing God. So here's my charge. Pursue after Him. Take that first commandment, that you shall have no other gods before me, and make it applicable in your life. And think of the ways and the attitudes and the habits that you and I have that may be causing us to have other gods before Him. I will see you next week as we continue this good study. Thank you.